The Silent Kingdom. The kingdom of Valmoria once thrived beneath skies adorned with golden light, its valleys echoing with the harmonious songs of its people. Music and laughter wove through the streets like an eternal melody, carried by the river that coursed through the land. Minstrels wandered from village to village, their ballads drifting through open windows, while storytellers spun their words in grand halls where the flickering firelight made shadows dance. Poets found their muse in the rustling of the trees, and the voices of lovers whispered beneath the stars. Valmoria was alive with sound, a realm where silence was a stranger. Then one fateful night, all fell still. It began as a hush that spread like an unseen tide. First, the wind faltered, its murmurs fading into an unnatural quiet. The chirping of crickets ceased, their nocturnal chorus swallowed by an eerie void. Then came the cries of alarm, voices that rose in panic but met only with mute air. A woman's wail turned into an open-mouthed gasp of horror. A child clutched his throat, his sobs reduced to silent trembles. The castle bells swung in desperate warning, issued not a single chime. The kingdom was voiceless. Panic gripped the land, but it was a soundless terror spreading like fire through the streets as people tried in vain to speak, to call for help, to scream. Yet not even the clash of steel upon stone could break the spell. The silence was absolute, not merely a loss of voices, but an erasure of sound itself. No whisper of wind, no rustling of leaves, no patter of rain. A void had descended, vast and unrelenting, and it would not be undone by mortal hands. In the great halls of Valmoria's palace, King Edrian and Queen Isolde stood among their council, their faces pale in the dim torchlight. They had seen war and famine, had faced invaders at their gates and sickness in their streets, but never had they encountered a calamity such as this. No assassin had come in the night, no army stood beyond their walls, yet their kingdom lay crippled by an unseen force. A single message had been left behind, scrawled upon the castle's highest walls in glowing runes that pulsed with an unnatural blue light. The writing was not in any language known to men, but the court sorcerers deciphered its meaning with trembling hands. When love is heard where silence reigns, the spell shall break, the voice unchained. And beneath it, a single symbol, the sigil of the Fairy of Dusk. The old tale spoke of her, a being neither wicked nor kind, one who walked the threshold between twilight and nightfall, her heart bound to the rhythm of the world. She was a guardian of the unseen, a keeper of lost songs. Long ago she had blessed Valmoria with prosperity, whispering to the rivers so they might sing, guiding the winds so they might carry melodies across the hills. Yet now she had turned her gift into a curse, and none knew why. The people of Valmoria searched desperately for answers. Sorcerers cast spells, alchemists brewed elixirs, priests prayed to the gods in whispered supplication, but no magic could lift the silence. Riders were sent to distant lands, but their messengers returned empty-handed, their pleas unspoken. The wisest scholars scoured ancient tomes, but the Fairy of Dusk was a mystery even to time itself. Days turned to weeks, then to months, then to years. The kingdom adapted, forced into a life of gestures and written words, of looks and unspoken understanding. The blacksmiths still hammered their metal, though their strikes made no sound. The farmers still tilled the land, though the earth swallowed the rustle of their harvest. The minstrels still played, though their fingers strummed silent strings. The people lived, but they did not truly live. The silence became their prison. And so the legend of Velmoria spread beyond its borders, a tale whispered in hushed tones by travelers who spoke of a kingdom without voices, a land where the winds did not blow, where even the rivers moved in eerie quiet. It became a mystery, an enigma that none dared to enter, for fear that they too would lose the very essence of their being. Yet, as the years passed, hope remained, a fragile ember in the darkness. The inscription on the castle walls had not promised eternal silence. The curse could be broken, but only by love, a love pure enough to be heard even in a world without sound. And so Velmoria waited for the one who would bring back their voices, waited for the one whose heart could sing where no music remained, waited for love to break the silence. The road into Velmoria was unlike any Alden had ever known. The land bore no scars of war nor signs of famine, yet there was something deeply wrong with it, something unnatural that sent a chill along his spine. As he crossed the borders of the kingdom, a hush swallowed the sound of his own footsteps. He halted, blinking in disbelief, then snapped his fingers beside his ear. Nothing. The familiar rustling of the wind in the trees, the gentle hum of insects, the distant chatter of a village ahead. Gone, as if the world had been stripped of its voice. His heart pounded as he took another step forward. The silence deepened. It did not feel empty like the quiet of a peaceful night. It felt stolen, hollow, as though some unseen force had drained the land of its essence. The trees did not sway, their leaves unnaturally still. The river that wound through the valley moved sluggishly, a silver thread gliding soundlessly over stones. Even his own breath seemed muted, a whisper swallowed before it could reach his ears. Alden pressed his fingers to the strings of his lute and strummed. His chest tightened when no melody came. He tried again, harder this time, his fingers moving with urgency, but still, the air remained void. It was as if the very world refused to acknowledge music. A surge of unease gripped him. He had lived by his songs, by the poetry of his voice. To be silenced so completely, it was suffocating. Determined to understand this strange curse, he pressed forward toward the distant outline of the kingdom's capital. The road led him to the outskirts of a small village, where houses stood in eerie stillness. People moved about, men carrying firewood, women weaving baskets, children playing in the fields, but their voices were absent. They gestured to one another with practiced ease, their expressions filled with meaning, yet the silence remained unbroken. As Alden approached, a few villagers noticed him. Their eyes, weary and solemn, flickered with curiosity. A woman stepped forward, her brows knitting as she gestured a question he could not understand. Alden opened his mouth to speak, but found himself hesitating, knowing no one would hear him. Instead, he reached for the small parchment in his satchel, pulling out a charcoal stick and writing a single question. What happened here? The woman's lips pressed together, her eyes heavy with sorrow. She took the parchment, her hands trembling slightly, and wrote back in flowing script, "The Fairy of Dusk." Alden exhaled slowly, recognition flashing through him. He had heard whispers of the name before, woven into the myths of old. A guardian of twilight, neither wholly benevolent nor cruel, but one who dealt in fate and consequence. If she had cast this spell upon the land, there had to be a reason. His silent conversation with the villagers revealed little more. They could not explain why the fairy had cursed them, only that it had begun long ago, on a night when the stars had seemed to flicker out one by one. The king and queen had sought a cure, but none had come. The inscription left on the palace walls was their only hope, a cryptic promise that love would break the spell. Alden pondered this as he continued on to the capital. The kingdom's heart loomed before him, its stone walls rising high against the pale sky. As he passed through the gates, he was struck by the sheer magnitude of the silence. The city was alive with motion, markets filled with merchants and buyers, nobles moving through the palace grounds, knights training in the courtyards. But not a single sound filled the air. The smiths' hammers struck the forges without a clang. The horses' hooves met the cobblestones without a clip-clop. It was a city that had adapted to its fate, moving forward despite the unnatural stillness that bound it. His steps carried him through the winding streets, past stone archways and towering spires, until he found himself before the royal palace. Its banners fluttered in the breeze, though they did so without a sound. He had come seeking answers, and if the inscription on the walls was to be believed, then they might lie within. As he stood before the grand entrance, his gaze was drawn upward. There, standing upon the highest balcony, was a maiden with golden hair that cascaded over her shoulders like spun sunlight. She wore a gown of deep sapphire, her delicate hands resting upon the stone railing as she gazed out over her silent kingdom. Their eyes met. Alden felt something stir deep within him, a pull stronger than curiosity, deeper than mere intrigue. There was a sorrow in her gaze, a quiet longing that mirrored the hush of the land. She was the first person he had seen who did not move with the acceptance of one accustomed to silence. Rather, she stood still, as if waiting for something that had yet to come. The princess. Even without words, Alden understood. She was the heart of this kingdom, the one who bore its burden in quiet solitude. And in that moment, as the wind passed between them in soundless lament, he knew that whatever fate had led him here, it was intertwined with hers. Something within him whispered that she was the key. That perhaps, in the hush of Velmoria, in the silence that had imprisoned its people for so long, a song was waiting to be sung. And he would be the one to find it. The castle loomed before Alden, its high towers reaching toward the sky like silent sentinels guarding a forgotten fate. Within its halls, nobility moved like phantoms, their robes trailing behind them, their lips forming words that would never be heard. Yet, despite the stillness that had settled over the kingdom like a shroud, the palace remained vibrant in its own way. Chandeliers cast golden light across marble floors, and gardens overflowed with roses in full bloom. Beauty lingered in Velmoria, but it was a beauty without song, frozen in time. Alden's mind remained tethered to the princess he had seen upon the balcony. Her presence haunted him, as if she were the echo of a melody he had once known, but could no longer recall. The way she had gazed upon the land, sorrow woven into the delicate lines of her face, told him that she understood the silence more deeply than any other. He knew then that if he was to break the spell, he must first understand it. It was this thought that led him beyond the palace gates, past the city's edge, and into the whispering embrace of the enchanted forest. Unlike the rest of Velmoria, where silence reigned with an unnatural grip, the forest felt alive in a way that unsettled him. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled roots twisting through the earth like veins of forgotten magic. The air was thick with mist, curling between the trunks in soft, shifting tendrils. Shadows played upon the undergrowth, and though there was no sound, Alden could feel something watching. The deeper he walked, the more the sensation grew, as though unseen eyes followed his every movement. The stories he had heard as a child spoke of this place in riddles, of spirits that wandered between worlds, of voices lost to time, of the fairy of dusk herself, weaving fate from the heart of the wood. And so he pressed forward, his steps careful upon the moss-laden ground, until he reached a clearing bathed in silver light. There, beneath the twisted boughs of an ancient willow, stood a figure formed of mist and shadow. The spirit did not move as Alden approached, nor did it acknowledge him in any way beyond its presence. It was neither man nor beast, but something in between, its form shifting like the ripples upon a still pond. It had no face, no voice, and yet, when Alden met its gaze, if it could be called that, his mind was flooded with visions. They came in flashes, brief yet overwhelming, each image seared into his thoughts before vanishing into the ether. A woman standing upon a moonlit hill, her eyes filled with sorrow as she reached for something beyond her grasp. A man with dark hair and cruel eyes, whispering words that twisted like smoke. A betrayal, a broken promise, a love turned to ruin. The visions coalesced into something deeper, something ancient. Alden saw the Fairy of Dusk as she once had been. Not a creature of vengeance, but a being of light and song. She had danced upon the twilight winds, her laughter woven into the very fabric of the world. She had loved the land, and it had loved her in return. But love, as Alden knew too well, was a fragile thing. It could be shaped into beauty or shattered into despair. The images shifted once more, showing him the moment everything had changed. A man, a prince, stood before the fairy, his hand outstretched in false devotion. She had trusted him, believed in his words, in the tenderness he had once shown. But he had betrayed her, casting her aside in pursuit of a crown. And in the wake of that betrayal, her sorrow had turned to anger, her magic twisting into a curse that bound Velmoria in silence. The kingdom had not simply been punished, it had been made to feel what she had felt. A love lost, a voice stolen, an endless silence where once there had been song. Alden stumbled back as the vision faded, his breath shallow, his heart racing. The spirit before him remained still, waiting. He did not need words to understand its meaning. The Fairy of Dusk had not cursed Velmoria without reason. The spell was not a mindless punishment, but a wound upon the land, one that could not be lifted by mere magic. It had to be undone in the same way it had been cast, through love. Not a fleeting love, not a love born of shallow promises, but one strong enough to be heard even in the deepest silence. A love unbroken by greed, by ambition, by fear. A love that would not fade. The realization settled over him like the weight of destiny itself. If he was to break the curse, he had to prove that such love still existed. That despite the pain and the sorrow, love could still sing. The spirit began to fade, its form dissolving into the mist like a forgotten whisper. Alden stood motionless, his fingers curled into fists, his mind racing with what he had learned. He had come seeking an answer, and now he had it. But knowledge alone would not be enough. He turned back toward the path that led to the castle, his resolve hardening with each step. The princess, Lyrian, was the key. She had lived her whole life within this silence, had carried its weight upon her shoulders, had waited for something that had yet to come. And Alden knew, deep in his bones, that he had not come to Velmoria by chance. Fate had brought him here. Now he would face the trials that awaited him. Now he would find the song hidden within the silence. The return to the castle felt heavier, as if the weight of the forest revelations pressed upon Alden's shoulders, dragging him deeper into fate's embrace. The silence of Velmoria, once eerie and unnatural, now carried meaning. It was no longer simply an absence of sound, but an echo of a broken heart, a wound carved into the soul of the land itself. He understood now. The Fairy of Dusk had not merely stolen voices. She had taken away the kingdom's very ability to express love, to share longing, to mend what had been broken. Only true love, one that could be felt even in the void, could break the spell. Alden's footsteps slowed as the palace loomed before him. Within its stone walls, among its cold, echoless corridors, lived the one person who might hold the key to shattering the curse. Princess Lyrienne, the golden-haired figure who had stood upon the balcony, her eyes fixed upon the silent horizon. He had felt the pull of her presence then, an unspoken connection that now seemed written in the very fabric of destiny. If love was the answer, then it was with her that he must find it. He was led through the palace by a steward whose eyes carried the quiet resignation of a man who had not heard his own voice in years. The halls were grand, their walls adorned with painted tapestries that told the history of Valmoria, not in words but in vivid images of feasts, battles, and love long lost. The farther they walked, the stronger Alden's heart pounded. He had faced many things in his life, wandered through kingdoms, sung before kings and paupers alike. But never had he approached something with such uncertainty. At last, the great doors of the royal garden were opened before him, revealing an expanse of green, untouched by the curse. Here, flowers still bloomed in brilliant colours, their petals trembling in the breath of an unseen wind. And at the heart of it all stood Lyrienne. She turned at his approach, her expression unreadable, though her blue eyes burned with something beneath the surface. In the absence of sound, the world felt smaller, as though only the two of them existed in that moment. Alden placed a hand over his heart, then pointed toward her, a question in his gaze. "Do you know why I am here?" For a long time she did not move. Then slowly she reached for the ribbon at her waist and pulled forth a small book. Its pages were worn, ink smudged from years of careful handling. She opened it, flipped through with steady fingers, and held it out to him. A single sentence was written there in delicate script. "The silence is my burden, but you have come to share it." Alden looked up, searching her face for meaning. There was no fear in her expression, nor expectation, only quiet understanding, as if she had always known someone would come, and yet had never dared to hope. He took the book from her hands and wrote beneath her words, "I will not let you carry it alone." Something shifted then. The garden, despite its stillness, seemed to breathe. Lyrienne's fingers tightened around the book as her gaze met his, and for the first time, Alden saw something beyond sorrow, something like the faintest glimmer of hope. And so the days passed, woven into the silent rhythm of the palace. Alden remained in Valmoria, walking its echoless halls, learning the unspoken language of its people. But more than anything, he learned her. He learned the way Lyrienne's lips pressed together when she was deep in thought, the way her fingers brushed over the petals of roses, as if searching for something she could not name. He learned how her eyes lit with silent laughter when he made a foolish mistake, how she would tilt her head skyward at night as if listening for stars. They spoke through written words, through fleeting touches, through the understanding that had begun to bloom between them. And Alden found himself lost in her. It terrified him. This feeling that had crept into his bones like a song he had never known. He had spent his life wandering, his heart never tied to one place, to one person. But here, in this silent kingdom, he had found something that held him still. Yet love alone was not enough. One evening, as the sun dipped beyond the walls, a dream came to him. The fairy of dusk stood in the moonlight, her form shifting between shadow and light, her sorrow pressing against him like a weight in the air. She raised a hand, and though her lips did not move, her voice filled his mind. Speak the maiden's name, and I shall grant you your voice. But the kingdom shall remain cursed. Or prove to me that your love is not selfish, and the silence will end for all. Alden awoke with his heart pounding. The choice burned within him. He could take back his voice in an instant, say Lyrian's name and hear her speak in turn. But it would not save Valmoria. To break the spell, his love had to be heard in a different way. The next morning, he found Lyrian waiting in the gardens, as she always did. But this time he did not reach for the book, did not write the words he longed to say. Instead, he did the only thing left to him. He sang. No sound left his lips, no melody filled the air. But his heart sang. His hand pressed against his chest, his fingers curled over his silent lute, and he let every unspoken word pour forth, not through sound, but through feeling. He sang of longing, of sorrow, of the quiet love that had taken root between them. He sang of the kingdom's silence, of the weight Lyrian carried, of the way her eyes had drawn him in and refused to let him go. And then Lyrian sang back. Her voice was soft at first, trembling like the first breath of dawn. But then it grew, rising into the air, carrying with it the sound Valmoria had lost. It was not merely a song. It was the breaking of a spell, the return of something stolen. The hush shattered like glass, and in its place came the rush of wind through the trees, the rustling of leaves, the distant murmur of water. The world exhaled, and for the first time in her life, Lyrian spoke his name. Alden. The silence was broken. The kingdom of Valmoria exhaled, as if it had been holding its breath for an eternity. The spell had shattered not with a thunderous roar, nor with a great clash of power, but with the simple and undeniable sound of love finding its voice. The wind returned first, stirring through the trees with a sigh of relief. The rivers followed, their waters whispering over stone, singing of freedom. Then came the cries of the people, their voices cracking, raw with emotion, stumbling over syllables they had not spoken in years. Laughter burst forth in uneven gasps, weeping in choked sobs, shouts of astonishment and joy breaking the hush that had imprisoned them for so long. But to Alden, all of it, the wind, the water, the voices, was nothing compared to the single sound that had freed them all. Lyrian had spoken his name. It was not merely a word. It was a key turning in the lock of fate. He stood before her, unable to move, the echoes of her voice still ringing through his soul. The weight of the moment crushed him, yet he had never felt lighter. The silence had been shattered, yet between them, a hush still lingered. A delicate pause that held more meaning than any spoken language ever could. She touched her throat, as if feeling the vibrations of her own voice for the first time. Then she parted her lips again, and this time, she did not say his name. This time, she laughed. It was a sound like sunlight, golden and warm, the kind of laughter that made flowers bloom and hearts tremble. The kind of laughter that had been waiting, buried beneath sorrow, waiting for love to unearth it. And Alden, who had spent his life chasing melodies, crafting ballads, weaving words into songs, had never heard anything so beautiful. Tears burned his eyes, and before he could think, before he could stop himself, he reached for her. His hands cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not even realized she had shed. Lyrian did not pull away. She only gazed up at him, and in her eyes he saw 1,000 words she would never need to say. The palace doors burst open. Servants and nobles poured into the gardens, their voices rising in astonishment, in disbelief, in utter joy. The king and queen arrived moments later, their steps hesitant, as if fearing this was all a dream that might slip away like mist. But when Queen Isolde whispered her daughter's name and Lyrian answered, the queen collapsed into her arms, weeping openly. Valmoria was whole once more. But there was one final presence still lingering in the garden, one shadow yet to be acknowledged. As Alden turned, he saw her standing at the edge of the courtyard, half hidden in the last traces of twilight. The Fairy of Dusk. She was neither smiling nor frowning, neither pleased nor angered. She simply was, her form shifting between the light and the dark, as if she belonged to both and neither at once. Her violet eyes, ageless and unreadable, rested upon Lyrian first, then on Alden. "You have done what many could not," she said, and her voice was like the first breath of evening, soft, cool, carrying the weight of the fading sun. "You have proven that love still endures, that it can be heard even in silence. You have broken my curse, yet you have also broken something far greater." Alden stepped forward, his pulse steady despite the power that radiated from her. "And what is that?" Her lips curved, not quite into a smile, but into something close. "You have broken the silence in my own heart." A hush settled over them once more, but it was not the hush of a curse, nor of sorrow. It was the quiet that comes after a long and weary storm, the stillness of peace returning to the land. The Fairy of Dusk stepped toward Lyrian, lifting a hand not in menace, but in benediction. A single luminous tear fell from her eye and landed upon the princess's brow. "A gift," the fairy murmured, "for all that was taken from you, for the years you endured, for the love that freed you. You will never forget the silence, but it will never hold you again." Then she turned to Alden, and for the first time he saw something human in her expression. "And you, Bard, you sought not glory nor power. You sought only to understand, to love without demand. Your voice is yours once more, but you will find that you no longer need it as you once did. Alden opened his mouth, and this time his voice returned to him. The sound startled him at first, yet it felt as if it had never truly been lost, only waiting for this moment. The fairy stepped back, and the twilight seemed to wrap around her like a cloak, drawing her into its embrace. I have lingered long in this world, but now I must return to the dusk. Valmoria will thrive once more. Guard it well. With those final words she faded, dissolving into the evening light, leaving behind only the whisper of a song on the wind. And so the silent kingdom became silent no more. In the days that followed, Alden remained by Lyrian's side as the kingdom celebrated its rebirth. Musicians played through the streets, filling the air with melodies long forgotten. Bells rang from the highest towers, their chimes echoing across the valleys. The laughter of children, the shouts of merchants, the simple greetings between old friends, all became a symphony of life returning. Yet amidst it all, Alden found himself in the palace garden once more, beneath the same tree where everything had changed. Lyrian stood beside him, her golden hair catching the last light of the sun. She turned to him, and when she spoke, there was no hesitation in her voice. "You gave me my first word," she said softly, "and now I will give you mine." She took his hands, and in that moment, Alden knew. There would be no more wandering, no more songs of distant lands. He had found his melody, not in the chords of his lute, nor in the lyrics of a ballad, but in the voice of the woman before him. And when he kissed her, it was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a song that would never fade. Thus, the legend of the Silent Kingdom became a tale of hope, a reminder that love, even in the deepest hush, will always find a way to be heard, way to be heard, way to be heard, way to be heard, way to be heard.